anyone who's had a death by suicide, what we know is not only you're worried about glamorizing it, but they get less casseroles, the funerals are less attended, they get less calls. A tragedy has taken place. And that tragedy and that death needs to be marked no matter how it comes about.
All right. Well, hey, teammates, welcome to the new normal. Once again, I'm your Chief Master Sergeant in the Air Force, Kay Wright, and this is a web series all about helping you find your new normal. Today, we have with us our guest, David Kessler, and he is one of the world's foremost experts on grief and loss, the author of 6 books, including the new best-selling book, Finding Meaning, The Sixth Stage of Grief. And he's taught many professionals and done a lot of great work and workshops, retreats in this area of grief. David, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Yeah. So again, thanks for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about the grief that people might be experiencing, not only with respect to COVID-19, but with the recent events that occurred beginning with the death of George Floyd?
Complicated question right there, but I will do my best. I think we all were living in a world a few months ago, and we thought that was our world forever, and we've had a pretty strong wake-up call. One piece of the wake-up call is that the world we knew and loved before COVID is gone forever. And part of our work is to grieve that world and to name the sadness we're feeling as things are reopening. The restaurants aren't the same. Nothing's going to be the same. And so there is some real grief there. We talk about grief, and people usually only know it about grief when someone dies. But the reality is we also grieve so many other things, whether it's a world that's gone, a wedding that's canceled, or life that just is no longer here. We also have so much going on in the world with race today. And that wake-up call is a good wake-up call. I have a very different experience as a white person than maybe some people. First of all, I'm so glad to be talking with you because part of what relates in my story is I grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi, right next to Kessler Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. So I knew, I saw people who were away from home serving their country. I got an appreciation at a young age for people who were serving in the Air Force. So, but also, I got into this work because my mother was dying, and I had grown up with a mother who was ill, and I also grew up in the South, and I knew things were different. For example, I think I was probably in the 2nd or 3rd grade, and I felt like a bit of an outcast because I was different in that I was Jewish in my elementary school, and I was the only Jew, and next to me was Mary, who was the only Black girl. And we knew that we weren't part of everyone else. And there was one day, like I said, this was 2nd or 3rd grade, the teacher said, last one in after recess back to the room has to kiss Mary. And I was like, really? Has to kiss Mary? The teacher's saying that? The authority and I knew, I couldn't have articulated, but I knew it was wrong. So, for me, when I hear so many white people who are just shocked, it's like, really? We're not shocked, we're in denial. It's time to come out of denial. This is not a new story. I've seen this my whole life. And it's time for change, and it's real change. And I love the pieces that you've written and how you're dedicated to change and making sure there's racial equality. We need white people to feel exactly that same way.
Yeah. So why do you think it's so hard for white people to have these conversations, or so easy for them to stay in denial as you mentioned?
We like to pretend it's not happening to us. We like to pretend it's somewhere else. It doesn't really happen that much. You know, one of the things that relates all this to COVID is we need visuals. You know, 100,000 people have died. Over 110,000 people have died. There's talk today there could be up to another 100,000. You haven't seen 100,000 funerals. You haven't seen caskets. I mean, we saw caskets and funerals in the Vietnam War after 9/11. We had visuals. There haven't been any visuals on this. We've had now with cell phones, and we are beginning to see the visuals. And George Floyd was a visual that we could not turn away from.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's shifted things. And I think it's a day of reckoning for us. So like, you know, we kind of, wasn't there one bad apple? Yeah, there was another bad apple. And look, I work with the police. The police are important and they are here to protect and serve. And the ones that I work with and know are dedicated to protecting and serving everyone equally. But we have to get past this. Well, there's a couple of bad apples. There's a lot of bad apples. And we can't just pretend like, oh, it's the police, let's fix that. I'm sorry, there's racism in corporate America. There's racism in every industry. We can't pretend if we like get rid of it in the police department, we've solved it.
Right.
We got to deal with racism in general.
Yeah. So Dave, we've been here before, right? So this is not new. There have been several incidents from Rodney King, you name it, that have caused us to start to begin this introspection about race and racism, and we need to do better, and we march and so on and so forth. What's your level of confidence that things are different this time?
I hope it's different because of white people waking up to the horrible injustices that have been going on. Mm-hmm. I hope that's what's going to change this. You know, let me just tell you, like I said, I was impressed by your piece that you wrote, that you were so dedicated to making sure that people who serve with you are treated fairly and equally. But I also want to say this, I live in Los Angeles. I can remember going to an emergency session with the city years ago. And they were talking about if the big earthquake comes to us, here's what we got to do. We got to do this, we got to do that. And someone said, excuse me, if the big earthquake hits LA, we're not saving us. We're not going to be the ones that are going to be able to fix this. We're going to need outside help. It's kind of the same. You know, you being dedicated to fixing this as an African American, you're kind of not the problem. I got to be dedicated to fixing this. Right. I think I'm more of the problem. We're all the problem.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Black leadership. There needs to be more white leadership.
Wow. I've been impressed, at least this time, by the level of leaders in our Air Force, especially at the most senior level, who are mostly white, to include my boss and the folks that I work for and around. Their level of commitment and dedication to helping us fix this. So I'm more hopeful this time than I have been in the past. And I still feel like lots of work yet to be done. And but I'm in it for the long haul. So we'll see how this plays out.
And, you know, I think we're in this situation where we've got a little more time on our hands. We're a little more open to being introspective. It's a challenging time between the pandemic and protesting that, you know, we don't want the protesting to make the pandemic worse. And the new normal, that's gone. You know, I was telling a friend, it feels like to me in this world, being in this new normal that none of us want, we're kind of waiting for the bell to ring so that everything gets back to normal. I'm afraid there might not be a bell. You know, I don't know that there's going to be a bell that's going to ring for us to go back to where we were.
Yeah.
So it's a shift in our thinking.
Yeah, it is hard to, it's a bit hard to imagine that things won't ever go back to the way that we were, because it was such a short time ago. I mean, it's only been what, 2 or 3 months when life was normal as we knew it, and restaurants were open, and I know things are beginning to open back up. But it's going to be interesting to see what level of grief, I would say, what level of grief and sadness and anxiety that causes people not being able to get back to the life as they knew it.
And I felt that. I've gone walking out on my street going, oh, things are opening back up. And I'm like, ooh, kind of sad opening.
Mm-hmm.
Not what, and oh, that restaurant's never coming back.
Yeah.
Oh, that place is going to be open, but I got to stand outside for a coffee. Oh, it's a new world.
Yeah. Hey, let me switch topics here for a minute. One issue that the race issue is, and COVID is kind of what we would consider the alligator in the boat. It's right upon us, and we got to deal with it.
Right.
But one serious issue that we've dealt with in the Air Force, certainly something that I've been committed to in the last few years, is suicide. Right. And what strategies would you recommend on how we as a service deal with suicides? We average about 110 suicides a year. We had a huge increase, about a 30% increase this past year, and that's out of roughly 680,000 airmen that are serving across the force. So relatively speaking, a small percentage, but nonetheless, when you take an inside look at each one and how they impact the families and the folks around them.
Our world is changing, and our view on death by suicide is changing. So first of all, we used to look at it as a selfish choice that people made because they wanted to die. We now know people are not choosing death. There is no choice in it. They are trying to manage their pain. And they do not see ways out of their pain. From everyone that we've worked with who has attempted a death by suicide and survived, they all tell us, I wasn't trying to die. I was trying to deal with horrific, intolerable pain. So the first thing we have to look at is they're in pain. The second thing is, it is not a choice. It is an illness. It is, we're not clear on all the aspects of it, but we know it is a miswiring of the brain. We see children at 2, 3, 4 years old who have self-harming thoughts. So this idea that, oh, they could choose a happy life or they could choose to just be in mental anguish is an old thought that's not true. And we have to treat it as an illness. How can we support people with this illness? We like to think on that side over there is people who are complete mentally healthy. And this side's complete mentally ill. The truth is, it's a continuum. We're all somewhere on that continuum. Mm-hmm. And we all have different baselines. And if your baseline is a little off and you get, stressors, it can push us more into the danger zone. So we have to get rid of the stigma around death by suicide and not look at that. It comes back to, it's not what's wrong with you, it's how can we help you?
Yeah.
How can we talk about it? The other thing is, we used to think if we know someone who might be having self-harming thoughts, we didn't want to mention death by suicide because we didn't want to give them the idea. Mm-hmm. We know that's wrong now. We know that it's okay to say, wow, yeah, I'm hearing things are pretty bad by the way you're talking. Have you thought about harming yourself? We actually do need to ask that question. We do need to check on people. We do need to talk about this.
Yeah, so I put this in that same category with race, with respect to being difficult to talk about. Why is it so difficult to have these conversations. You know, last year we asked our Air Force to do a bit of a stand down and just take a day and talk to your people about, you know, suicide and resiliency and so on and so forth. And some people had a lot of leaders had a really, really difficult time. And to be frank, some just kind of ignored it. They spent just a few minutes just to check a block to let us know that they did it. But not everyone had meaningful conversations about resilience and suicide. Why is it so hard?
We have a lot of old religious beliefs that we believe that it is a sin. And the sin implies that it is a choice. And there was a time where there was stigma around cancer. There was a time where there was shame around cancer. That's shifted now. My hope is someday, and I believe certainly religions are changing and beginning to realize whether it's cancer or death by suicide or addiction or Alzheimer's or whatever, these are illnesses that get progressively worse if untreated.
Yeah. What I've always been a little conflicted about how we choose to deal with memorializing people who die by suicide. So I'll just tell you, there's a bit of this mentality in the military that by having a big memorial, by celebrating their life like you would anyone else who passed with a memorial and a funeral service and whatnot, that you tend to glamorize it. And so we shouldn't celebrate them the same we do as other people who pass away. What are your thoughts about
and let's go to the other side of that. Anyone who's had a death by suicide, what we know is not only you're worried about glamorizing it, but they get less casseroles, the funerals are less attended, they get less calls. You know, a tragedy has taken place. And that tragedy and that death needs to be marked no matter how it comes about. You know, when we're ill and we die, that death, and we're seeing that now with COVID, they deserve to be marked in real time. And that's part of the thing that, if we have a memorial and talk about it and do it any kind of way that we would do it for anyone else, we might be glamorizing it. So we give less support to the bereaved, and that's got to change.
Yeah, no,
glamorizing isn't the problem. We're not even there. We're not there.
Yeah, no, I agree. Hey, you want to talk briefly about the 5 stages and then
Sure.
the 6th stage that you wrote about?
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969 wrote about the 5 stages of dying. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I was so privileged to work with her when we adapted those stages for grief and in our book on grief and grieving. And a couple of things. One, we said on page 1 of the book on grief and grieving, they're not linear. You don't have to do these in order. Grief is very messy. It's not a map for grief. But over the years, a few things have happened. They've become like 5 easy steps for grieving, and they're not. And they're not a map. And grief's going to be really messy. There's no one right way. There's no one right model for grief. There's only your way to grieve. And the other thing that happened is acceptance took on a finality, like, when you hit acceptance, you're done. I always say when people say, how long will we grieve? I say, well, how long is the person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve a long time. Now, that doesn't mean you will always grieve with pain. My hope is we can grieve in time with love and with honor and with remembrance for those who have died. And then a few years ago, my younger son died unexpectedly. And it was as brutal as anyone would think it was, and it's still brutal. But I remember as I began to feel just little pieces of acceptance that, like, I can't stop at acceptance. Acceptance isn't enough. just don't want to accept that he died. I want there to be more. And I studied people like Viktor Frankl, who in concentration camps in World War II appreciated a sunrise and a sunset. How do you find light in the darkness? And I was so intrigued by that. And I started interviewing people that their spouses had died. So many people who had served our country had died. And their children, their parents had died, their pets had died. And they found meaning. And I wanted to know, how do we not come out of things with post-traumatic trauma, but with not with post-traumatic trauma and post-traumatic stress, but with post-traumatic growth? And so that led me to the sixth stage, which is meaning. And I'm so honored that the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross family and foundation gave me permission to add that sixth stage. And I think it's so important in our world today. How do we not just go through the pandemic? How do we not just go through the protests, go through the uncomfortable race stuff that's going on, that's been such a horrible injustice in this country? How do we not just go through it, but how do we grow through it?
No, that's fantastic. I really appreciate because I know many of our service members, just like many folks around this country, they really do struggle with grief and grieving, given all the things that are happening in our country right now.
And if anyone is dealing with the death of a loved one, we have an online grief group that we started after COVID that people can find at grief.com.
Yeah, good. Hey, so speaking of, things like that, online grief group that you started, how have you and your team adjusted to the new normal of things like we're doing now, Zoom calls, meetings, and utilizing technology?
Well, it's changed because, there used to be very clear lines between work and home. And, this is when the day ends. And I think, well, on one hand, it's great that my office is like right here and we can do this here. I don't have to travel to you anymore. And the bad news is it's right here and it can be a call at any time. And there's sort of, so I think boundaries are a big thing we're all trying to learn. And how do we make structure in this world that doesn't have as much structure anymore? But the group came out of when all the grief groups got shut down, when people were still dying and people were dying of COVID and their family members had nowhere to go. We're like, well, we're just going to take it online. 1,000 people showed up the first day, going to take it online.
Wow, that's amazing. I think this is important, not just for technology's sake, but I know I've heard some stories and actually dealt with some of our airmen who lost loved ones. Now we have exceptions to policy for immediate family members, but they've lost loved ones who didn't necessarily qualify as an immediate family member, and so they weren't able to travel home to the homegoing or to the funeral, and so they were dealing with grief in a whole different kind of way.
And by the way, you people not only can find that group, but as you mentioned, a lot of people have dealt with a death by suicide. There's also a free class I have called griefsuicide.com. They can find it at griefsuicide.com, completely free to help family members. And, we have to just know that there's so many people. When we hear 110,000 people have died, think about that. Two things I want to say about that. How many family members does that mean there are? That means there's like 500,000, millions of family members that have had someone die to COVID. And the other thing is, because there's been no visual, I want to give you one on that 110,000. Imagine if in the last 2 months, 724 Southwest airline planes crashed. What world would that be? What if every 2 hours, and I say Southwest, I love Southwest, but we all sort of know the size of their planes. What if every 2 hours another plane crash happened? That's what's been going on in these United States, but with no visual, we don't get it. So think of that visual of how many planes have went down.
Yeah, man, that is a great visual. It's actually hard to believe sometimes as you
hard to believe.
Yeah, as you think about it.
And it's also, there's another factor in there that goes back to everything. So many people have died, have been some of the unseen in our society,
Hmm.
the elderly, those in poverty, so many disparities in so many, disproportionate African Americans, Blacks, Latinos. I mean, our elderly, it's all the people that, if this happened to white suburbia, oh my gosh, if those planes were landing in white suburbia, be different.
Yeah, yeah.
They were crashing there, it'd be different.
Yeah. I really appreciate not only your work with grief, but the comments that you made in the beginning with respect to race and the need for more of our white leaders to step up and talk about and help own this problem. Again, I'm
We
hopeful.
have to have these conversations. They have to get uncomfortable. We got to do this.
Yeah, yeah, and it's I know it's a lot of work, and I don't, like I wrote in the piece, I don't expect it to change overnight. But I think the more we have these difficult and challenging conversations, the more people can get comfortable with their own place in systemic racism that we all live with each and every day. The easier these conversations will become. So we just got to keep having them.
And I got to tell you, I think we need to expect it to change. People are dying. It's horrific. And it's been going on too long. So I'm going to, I hope everyone speeds this up because the pace we've been at is not acceptable.
Right. I agree. Well, hey, Dave, that's all the time we have today. And I really want to thank you. I'll leave the final comments to you.
Well, I'm just so honored that you would have me here. And I think this is the kind of conversation that's going to change our future. And I think no one of us is going to have the solution. We're all going to have it.
Yeah.
When tragedy happens, when grief happens, one of the things I say is grief must be witnessed. And we have to witness the grief of the families who have been left behind with COVID. We also have to witness all the grief that's been unattended with so many deaths that have been, come about by race. And there's such an apology that's owed. And I want to be the first to really own that apology and be part of the change. And that's these conversations that we're having. So thank you for having me be there. And I appreciate your work so much. And thank you for your service of our country.